Hidden behind guarded gates in Surrey stands one of the most mysterious royal residences in Britain. Bagshot Park has been described in the press as a £30 million mansion, with around 120 rooms, 51 acres of grounds, and a maintenance bill fit for a palace. It is home to the king's youngest brother, Prince Edward, and because the estate is connected to the crown, it would be easy to assume that the king could simply ask for the keys. But the truth is far more complicated. Buried inside the history of Bagshot Park are three details that change everything: a £5 million payment, a lease lasting 150 years, and a word with enormous consequences, assignable. So who really controls Bagshot Park? And if the king ever wanted his brother's home returned, could he actually take it back? Before we begin, this video is based on parliamentary records, official royal announcements, historical sources, and contemporary press reporting. The private thoughts and conversations of the royal family are not publicly known. Where the media has reported a claim, or where we explore a possible scenario, it will be identified as reporting, speculation, or analysis, not established fact. Some scenes and descriptions are presented dramatically for entertainment, but no undocumented confrontation should be understood as something that definitely occurred. With that distinction made, the documented story of Bagshot Park is already more surprising than any palace rumor. Bagshot Park looks like the sort of house that should come with a crown. The present mansion was built between 1875 and 1879 for Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, the third son of Queen Victoria. It was designed as a grand royal residence in the Victorian Gothic style, with towers, ornate brickwork, and the scale expected of a son of the most powerful monarch of the age. But Bagshot Park did not remain a conventional family palace. During the 20th century, its purpose changed. From 1947, the estate was used by the Army Chaplains Department. For nearly half a century, a mansion built for Queen Victoria's son served an institutional and military role. By the time the Ministry of Defense left in 1996, Bagshot Park was no longer simply a beautiful royal home waiting for its next occupant. It was a vast historic property in need of restoration, maintenance, and a financially workable future. That distinction matters. Large country houses can be magnificent from the outside and brutally expensive behind the facade. Roofs, stonework, heating systems, historic interiors, and acres of grounds do not maintain themselves. A house with around 120 rooms, if the commonly reported figure is correct, can become a liability as easily as a privilege. Modern press reports have placed the estate at roughly 21 hectares, or about 51 acres, and have sometimes valued it at approximately £30 million. But that figure is a reported estimate, not a current official valuation published by the Crown Estate. The more important number in the 1990s was not what Bagshot Park might be worth in theory. It was what it would cost to make the place habitable and keep it that way. When the military occupation ended, the estate needed a new plan. The Crown Estate considered its future and marketed the property. And at almost exactly that moment, Queen Elizabeth's youngest son was approaching a new stage in his own life. Prince Edward had met Sophie Rhys-Jones. Their relationship was becoming serious. A marriage, a household, and a permanent family residence were all moving from distant possibilities towards practical questions. Bagshot Park offered extraordinary status, privacy, and royal history. It also offered cracked walls, repair obligations, and decades of expense. This was not going to be a simple case of the Queen handing her son a palace. It was going to require a deal. Prince Edward expressed an interest in Bagshot Park after the Ministry of Defense vacated the estate. To critics, any agreement between a royal prince and the Crown Estate could immediately look like an inside arrangement. But the official account is more structured than that. Information supplied to Parliament says the negotiations were conducted at arm's length and supported by independent valuations. In other words, the property was not supposed to be valued according to Edward's royal status, but according to the commercial conditions of the estate and the obligations being accepted. Those obligations were considerable. The restoration was funded through several different contributions, each with a different purpose. The Ministry of Defense contributed approximately £1.8 million in connection with outstanding repair responsibilities from its occupation. The Crown Estate allocated approximately £1.6 million. Edward invested approximately £1.38 million of his own money. These figures have sometimes been blended together in retellings, creating the impression that public money simply renovated a luxurious home for a prince. The reality was more complicated. Part of the money concerned obligations attached to the previous institutional tenant. Part came from the estate owner. Part came from the incoming royal occupant. And none of those restoration contributions meant Edward had purchased Bagshot Park's freehold. That is the first essential distinction in this story. Someone who owns a freehold owns the property and land outright, subject to the normal law. A leaseholder owns a time-limited legal interest created by a contract. That interest can be extremely valuable and can last longer than a human lifetime. But it is not the same as owning the underlying property forever. Bagshot Park remained part of the Crown Estate. Edward was negotiating for the right to occupy and use it under agreed conditions. The condition of the house helped shape the financial bargain. A tenant prepared to invest heavily, accept repairs, and maintain a difficult listed property may negotiate different terms from somebody taking possession of a modern home with no major obligations. That is why looking at only one number, annual rent, premium or renovation cost, can be misleading. The complete bargain included the length of the lease, the money paid at the beginning, repair responsibilities, future rent arrangements, permitted uses, and the risks carried by the tenant. In 1998, the first version of that bargain was completed. It was significant, but it was not yet the extraordinary 150-year arrangement that protects Edward's position today. The original Bagshot Park agreement gave Edward's side a 50-year residential lease. It was assignable, meaning the leasehold interest was not necessarily tied only to Edward personally for every remaining year. Any transfer would still be governed by the contract and the law, but the word gave the lease a life beyond a purely informal royal favor. The initial annual rent was £90,000. That rent was reviewable every 15 years by reference to the Retail Prices Index. At first glance, £90,000 a year may sound modest for a mansion reportedly worth tens of millions. But annual rent was only one part of the calculation. The tenant was also accepting substantial restoration costs and continuing maintenance obligations. On an estate of this age and size, those responsibilities can represent millions of pounds over time. The stable block was included in the arrangement as well, together with permission to sublet it. That clause would attract far more attention many years later. For the moment, however, the first lease appeared to establish a relatively straightforward balance. Edward gained a long-term family residence. The Crown Estate gained a tenant who would invest in and maintain a difficult historic property, and the agreement retained a scheduled rent, subject to future review. 50 years is a long time in an ordinary housing agreement. For a royal residence, however, it still left an obvious question. Edward was in his 30s when the lease was agreed. If the full term ran without major alteration, it would expire during his old age. The arrangement gave him security, but not necessarily a residence capable of remaining under family control across several generations. Then, in 1999, Edward and Sophie married. They became the Earl and Countess of Wessex, and Bagshot Park became their principal family home. Their daughter, Lady Louise, was born in 2003. Their son, James, was born in 2007. The estate was no longer simply a restoration project or a residence for a newly married royal couple. It had become the setting of a family life. And in that same year, 2007, the legal foundations beneath the family home changed dramatically. The earlier 50-year lease was renegotiated. The new terms were not merely a small extension. They transformed the timescale of the entire arrangement. Under the 2007 agreement, the lease became assignable for a term of 150 years. The premium was £5 million. That payment is the central fact behind the Bagshot Park mystery. A lease premium is a substantial sum paid for the leasehold interest and the rights created by the contract. It is not the same as purchasing the freehold. Edward did not buy Bagshot Park outright, but his side acquired a legal interest designed to endure far beyond the original 50-year arrangement. 150 years reaches well into the 22nd century. It is longer than the expected lifetime of anyone involved in the negotiation. It is longer than Edward's lifetime title as Duke of Edinburgh, and it could outlast the reigns of several future monarchs. The Crown Estate says independent valuations were used to determine fair market value at the time of the agreement. That is important because a £5 million premium cannot be judged honestly without also considering what the tenant received and what the tenant promised to carry. The lease came with long-term control and security, but the tenant remained responsible for maintaining an enormous historic building. The transaction, therefore, exchanged a very large upfront payment and continuing liabilities for an exceptionally long contractual interest. This is where the popular image of royal power begins to collide with ordinary property law. When Charles became king in 2022, he inherited the crown and all the constitutional symbolism that came with it. He did not personally inherit the power to erase a commercial lease simply because the tenant was his brother. The agreement already existed. The premium had already been paid. The property interest had already been created, and the Crown Estate was not operating as the late Queen's private household, handing rooms to family members on a casual basis. It had entered a valued transaction. That does not make the lease untouchable under every imaginable circumstance. Leases can expire. They can be surrendered by agreement. They may contain enforcement rights when obligations are seriously breached. They can sometimes be renegotiated, but those are contractual and legal processes. They are not royal commands. So if somebody inside the palace disliked the arrangement today, personal influence alone would not automatically undo it. The king could have an opinion. The family could have a disagreement. The newspapers could demand action, but the signed lease would still be there. And to understand why Charles cannot simply treat Bagshot Park as his own house, we have to look more closely at the institution that actually manages it. The name Crown Estate creates an understandable confusion. It sounds like another way of saying the king's property. Legally and financially, that is not how it operates. The Crown Estate is a statutory organization managing a vast portfolio of land and property. It is associated with the monarchy, but it is not the sovereign's private investment account. The king cannot sell the portfolio and keep the proceeds. The Crown Estate's net revenue is paid to the Treasury. Its management duties are governed by law, and its commercial decisions are made through an organization expected to protect the value of the estate. Most importantly for Bagshot Park, information given to Parliament states that Crown Estate commercial leases do not require the sovereign's personal approval. That means Charles is not sitting at Buckingham Palace personally approving each rent review, sublease, or property negotiation. Nor can he automatically behave as though Bagshot Park were a privately owned weekend house that he had lent to his younger brother. There are royal homes where the ownership and financial arrangements are different. Balmoral and Sandringham, for example, are privately owned by the monarch. Official residences such as Buckingham Palace have their own constitutional position. Bagshot Park belongs to another category, a Crown Estate property occupied through a long commercial lease. Those distinctions are rarely obvious in a photograph. A royal family member steps from a car. A grand house stands behind guarded gates. The public sees a palace, but beneath the image may be an entirely different combination of ownership, leasehold rights, public responsibility, and private expense. Bagshot Park's combination is particularly unusual because of the length and value of Edward's agreement. The freehold remains with the Crown Estate. The long leasehold interest belongs to the tenant named in the arrangement. Eclipse Nominees Limited, identified in parliamentary material in connection with the Duke of Edinburgh. So neither of the simplest claims is correct. It is not accurate to say Edward owns the entire estate outright, but it is equally misleading to say Charles owns it, so he can take it tomorrow. The better description is that the Crown Estate owns the underlying property, while Edward's side holds an exceptionally long and potentially valuable leasehold interest. This is the real source of his security. Not a promise between brothers. Not a title granted by their mother. Not the continuing goodwill of the king. A contract. And the power of that contract became even more controversial when public attention turned from the mansion itself to a converted stable block within the estate. The right to sublet part of Bagshot Park was not discovered yesterday. The stable block was included in the lease arrangements, and permission to sublet it formed part of the original bargain. Evidence discussed in Parliament indicates that subletting rights were considered when the transaction was valued. In simple terms, if a tenant receives the right to earn money from part of a property, that right can increase the value of the lease. A commercial valuation may therefore take the potential income into account when calculating the premium and other terms. In March 2026, the Standard reported that converted accommodation in the stable block could command £10,834 per month. That would amount to roughly £130,000 over a full year. The figure produced an immediate and predictable question. If the building forms part of a Crown Estate property, why should the tenant be able to retain income from renting it? Critics saw a royal family member potentially receiving private income from an estate associated with the public realm. The contractual answer was less emotionally satisfying, but legally more relevant. The subletting permission was reportedly part of the valued agreement. Parliamentary evidence concerning royal leases explained that where such rights were included in the original transaction, the resulting income could remain with the tenant because the benefit had already been reflected in the bargain. There is also an essential qualification. The Standard included a response from a royal source saying that the property was not, at that time, rented or being marketed. So the reported £130,000 figure should not be presented as confirmed income actually received by Edward and Sophie. It was an estimate of what the accommodation might command. That difference matters. Potential rent is not collected rent. A permitted sublease is not proof that a current tenancy exists. And a controversial clause is not evidence that anyone has broken the agreement. Nevertheless, the dispute revealed why these royal leases attract public scrutiny. The Crown Estate pays its net revenue to the Treasury. The properties carry royal associations. Yet some agreements include private rights negotiated decades earlier, with details that are not always obvious to the public. In July 2026, parliamentary questioning continued around the treatment of subletting provisions in royal residential leases, including Bagshot Park. The broader concern was transparency. Were the original valuations robust? Were all valuable rights properly included? And should income connected to such properties be monitored more openly? Those are legitimate public questions, but they still do not change the central legal reality. If the subletting right was granted and priced as part of the lease, outrage alone does not remove it. And even if public pressure encouraged the Crown Estate to take a harder position in future agreements, Edward's existing contract would remain the starting point. Which leads to an even more intriguing question. Edward's newest and most prestigious title ends with his lifetime. The Bagshot Park lease does not. In March 2023, King Charles conferred the Dukedom of Edinburgh on Prince Edward. It was a deeply symbolic decision. Edward had spent years supporting the Duke of Edinburgh's award and carrying forward work associated with his father, Prince Philip. But the palace announcement included a crucial limitation. Edward would hold the title for his lifetime. This version of the Dukedom of Edinburgh is not designed to pass automatically to his son, James. When Edward dies, the title and the Bagshot Park lease therefore face different futures. The title ends according to the terms on which it was granted. The lease may still have many decades left to run. That does not mean James or Lady Louise automatically inherits the right to live at Bagshot Park. It does not mean the house becomes a hereditary royal possession. And it certainly does not mean Edward can leave the Crown Estate's freehold to his children, because he does not own that freehold. What it means is that the leasehold interest must be considered separately. The parliamentary description calls the lease assignable, and the named tenant is a company connected with Edward. Any future assignment, Inheritance arrangement, change of company control, or continued occupation would depend on the detailed lease terms and the applicable law. Those full private terms are not all available for the public to inspect. So the honest question is not, which child definitely receives Bagshot Park? The honest question is, who could lawfully control or occupy the remaining lease? And under what conditions? That is a far more interesting mystery because the contract may endure while royal roles change around it. Edward could cease to be Duke of Edinburgh, yet the lease would not disappear merely because his title did. A future king could have completely different plans for the working royal family, yet the contract would still require legal treatment. The monarchy might become smaller. Public expectations might change. The market value of the estate might rise dramatically. But a 150-year lease is designed precisely to create stability across changing circumstances. This is why the Bagshot Park question is not really about which brother has the higher rank. Charles is the sovereign. Edward is the leaseholder connected with the occupying company. Those positions operate in different systems. Royal hierarchy places Charles above every other member of the family. Property law does not allow hierarchy alone to cancel a valid agreement. So could Bagshot Park ever return to direct Crown estate control? Of course, but not simply because the king asked for it. The clearest route would be the natural expiry of the lease, although that lies far into the future. The parties could also negotiate an early surrender or a new arrangement. That would normally require agreement and could involve substantial financial terms. The leasehold interest might be assigned in a way permitted by the contract, or if a serious qualifying breach occurred, the Crown estate might seek whatever remedies the lease and the law allowed. Those are legal possibilities, not claims about anything currently happening. There is no verified public evidence that Charles has launched a formal attempt to evict Edward from Bagshot Park. There is no verified evidence of a courtroom battle between the brothers, and there is no need to invent one. The documented truth contains its own reversal. The most senior figure in the monarchy cannot simply rewrite a commercially valued lease held by a junior member of his own family. At Bagshot Park, royal influence meets a boundary built from independent valuation, money already paid, obligations already accepted, and a contract intended to survive for generations. The king may embody the crown, but he is not Edward's private landlord. Bagshot Park is not simply Prince Edward's private property, and it is not simply King Charles's house to reclaim. It is a Victorian royal mansion, a crown estate asset, a costly restoration project, and the subject of one of the longest and most unusual residential leases connected to the modern royal family. Royal titles can end within a generation. Public reputations can change overnight. Even reigns are measured in decades. But a carefully negotiated contract can continue for a century and a half. So perhaps the real Bagshot Park controversy is not whether Charles wants the house back. It is how much the public should be allowed to know about agreements involving royal residences. Should those leases be made fully transparent? Or should they be treated like any other private commercial arrangement? Tell us what you think, because behind the gates of Bagshot Park, the most powerful document is not a royal decree. It is the lease.